Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender, where we take that deep dive into the most important economic issues facing agriculture. I'm your host, Carly Jacobson, and I'm back here with David Widmar and Brent Gloy from Agricultural Economic Insights, along with our own financial officer, Jessica Larson from Southeast Nebraska. So producers are tasked with making many decisions each day, some minor, others major. And in today's webinar, we're going to dig into some of the more interesting tricks our minds can play on us when making decisions. So Brent, let me get this kicked over to you to get us started, please.
Welcome. This is I think, going to be a really awesome episode because of Two Economists and Lenders. I'm pretty excited about it because decision traps are something that we all, I don't know. I shouldn't maybe say we all. I find myself falling into these all the time. And these are things that kind of screw up our thinking. And I joked with David that I think putting this PowerPoint together was pretty easy because he just went through a list of all the ways that he's helped me get over some of these screwy ways of thinking about things that I find myself getting into. And so we're excited to share this with you today. And we hope that at the end of this, you come up with a few heuristics or ways to think about things that help you make better decisions. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're all trying to do, is make the best decisions we can in our business. Now, all of this decision making is, I think it's the troubles we have with it get compounded in a rapidly shifting environment, and that's what we have today. If we look at the Purdue's Ag Economy Barometer, which David actually helped start and ran for several or a couple years, I think. This is a gauge of producer sentiment around farmer sentiment around the country. And one of the things you see is that sentiment today is as low, not all-time lows, but getting very close to as low as it's ever been. And if you would tell me that we have this barometer generally, I mean, honestly, it pretty closely tracks commodity prices. It's not usually that interesting. When commodity prices are high, the sentiment's high. When they're low, sentiment's low. But this is a unique situation because commodity prices are pretty darn high, yet sentiment is really low, and I think that reflects the stress that's out there. There's just a lot of pressure right now to make good decisions, and I think producers everywhere are feeling it. And so in this kind of environment, what we want to do is make sure that we don't fall into these decision traps. And there's a very famous psychologist named Daniel Kahneman that came up with some of the most interesting work, I think, on decision making that I've ever come across. And he talked a lot about this idea in his book, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow, of level one thinking versus level two thinking. And level one thinking is this fast, quick decision making that we make. And so think about, if I'm going to get ready to cross the street, I look both ways. Is it safe to cross? Yes or no? Boom, we go. We don't have to, look at the car and say, well, it's coming at, approximately 30 miles. Our brain just tells us, yeah, it's safe, go, or no, hey, it's not. Stay on the sidewalk. Now, that type of decision making works really well for most things that we do, but it doesn't work very well for things that are a little bit more complex, and particularly again to a lot of our business decisions, marketing, production decisions, you name it. Those are things that we really need to get our brain into this level two thinking, which is more contemplative. We have to sit and really think about, process, take some time to make good decisions so that we're not doing it like the two guys in this cartoon, which is, hey, I've got a great decision making process. Just throw a paper airplane up, whichever basket lands in, go that way. That's not going to work very well. We want to get our brain slowed down so we can take time to contemplate and make the good decisions that we need to make. So, today, right now, is a perfect example of it. If you look around the country, I don't know where everybody's at on this webinar, but where I am, I describe the situation as epic, an epic drought. It's really bad. 20% of normal rainfall. So it's really ugly situation. I think a lot of Nebraska and maybe even parts of Iowa are kind of feeling that same way. Email from a friend in Wisconsin today. Hey, it's, things had been looking pretty good. Now it's starting to maybe not look so good. So, the crop is getting, we're having to make decisions about marketing. At the same time, commodity prices are falling. We want to get out of this kind of snap fast decision making and get into this contemplative thinking. But let me ask you a question. So if you think about it, let's start with a little poll. So I want you to consider the following outcomes. The U.S. suffers a massive widespread drought, and in turn, the U.S. corn and soybean crops are the worst in a decade, or the U.S. corn crop is below trend in 2022. What's your feeling? Which of these outcomes is more likely? Okay, we should be getting some votes here shortly. So this is good because the people on this call are thinking. You got your brain a little bit out of that type 1 thinking, because this is something called the narrative bias. And the narrative bias is we tend to tell ourselves this big story and confuse ourselves around which of these is more likely. Clearly, being below trend is more likely than just having an absolute disaster. It's a small subset.
Yeah, Brent. So, if you think about these nested Venn diagrams that are there on the left, the bottom option, the scenario where the U.S. corn yield is below trend, there's a whole host of ways that could come together. And then when you think about the yellow circle, that represents that first option where both crops are not only below trend, but they're the worst in a decade. So they had been worse than the last 9 crops ahead of it. And so these stories are really powerful, and it's just one of those examples of where your level 1 thinking has a little bit of a fault in it. That automatic kind of thought process isn't perfect, and it can get you into trouble sometimes. And so with the narrative bias, one time I read a story or a book, and it really talked about how our brains as humans are really, really attracted to stories. And in fact, it could be a little bit of a fault in our thinking. And why does that happen? Well, our brains are sort of easily deceived by stories because the stories are written in a way that rely on hindsight. So the story gets told after the moral or the ending is already known. And so the whole point is to get you to this conclusion. And if you think about writing a story or writing an article, you kind of follow an arc of a journey to get the audience to see your conclusion. So this kind of by design, it's sort of to lead you to a conclusion. The other thing that happens with stories is our thinking gets distracted or connected or wrapped up in the details of personal connections. And so, as Brent was telling the story, Iowa stuck out in my mind because that's a big corn state. And so when things get difficult in Iowa, we better pay attention. Or maybe somebody who, I know Brent in Western Nebraska, and he's worried about this drought. And so it's another observation that ties in with the personal connection that I always have. So what are some strategies that we can use? Again, Brent and I today are going to share three biases or 3 decision traps that have been documented across a lot of people in the country. You could be immune to it, or you could be immune to it all the time or some of the time, but we want to sort of highlight these and then share some examples of strategies for avoiding it. So the first one here with the narrative bias is, what part of the story is most likely true? You can step back and say there are elements of this that seem maybe not realistic or maybe a little bit far-fetched. The second thing that you can follow up with is what's verifiable. What can I, how can I check some data, or how can I get another observation on this? And finally, you should ask yourself, how much weight should I be putting on this? And there's probably never one story or anecdote that we should ever put our entire marketing plan behind, right? We should always want to be collecting as much information as possible. And so always think about, how much weight do I put onto this, and how much other information do I need to see before I jump to that conclusion?
It's crazy how powerful these stories are and how much they can kind of influence your thinking subconsciously. But I think just the narrative part is really interesting. There's pretty much every week I send David a Twitter thing and say, like, is this true? The latest one being, the robot that was like had the gun and was shooting at targets, and then the handlers would stand in front of him and it wouldn't shoot them, and he'd move out of the way and the robot would shoot the target right over his shoulder. I'm like, there were a lot of flags in that made me think this is probably not true. And of course, David was like, yeah, it's been debunked like 5 times. So, I mean, we just have to put our flags up for this. So I just had one the other day. I was talking to somebody and they said, well, I talked to Joe, and his the meteorologist he's been following is suggesting this, and I found myself, I don't know Joe, I don't know the meteorologist he's using, but I found myself wanting to believe what I had heard, at least fourth hand, because it fit with what I wanted to hear. And so I think, we just have to get our brain off of that kind of story that we like. So here's another interesting one. So let's say you are flipping a fair coin. So it means 50-50 chance to go heads or tails. If it lands on tails, you lose $10. If it lands on heads, you win. Okay. How much would you have to win in order to play this game? Okay, so this is interesting, and we did have a bet on this outcome between all of us that were on this webinar, and I don't know, I wanted 20 and under. I don't think they were going to give that to me, so I think the majority of the way is 20 to 28, which is interesting because if it's a fair coin, your expected value, the chance of you winning, at $12 is $2. I mean, if you play that game a bunch of times, that's probably what you come ahead. And people go to Las Vegas and play games that have a negative 3-cent or 4-cent bias all the time. So it's just interesting. I would have thought a few more people. I thought 20 would be most common, but I thought a few more people would be at 12.
So Brent, before we talk about this one, the loss aversion bias, I want to also share with the group, we spent a lot of time wrestling with how to write this question, the narrative that was informing this. So you could spend a little bit of time thinking about, what if we just said you're playing this game with your friend? Or what if you're playing this game with some mobster on the streets of New York City? And so you can see how that narrative could impact how this plays out. And so sometimes these outcomes don't happen in a vacuum. They don't happen by themselves. They get woven together. So this particular decision trap is the loss aversion bias. And the idea here is that humans are more susceptible to loss than they are gains. In fact, it's roughly the rule of thumb is that it's about twice as powerful to lose something than it is to gain. And so if you think about the way we wrote that question, we said you're going to lose $10, and so that triggered your brain in a likely way. There's a couple other examples I think are worth sharing. If you found a $100 bill on the sidewalk, you'd put it in your pocket and you'd probably forget about it, by lunch or by the end of the day. You might remember to tell your family, but it's not going to give you a whole lot of pleasure throughout the entire day. If you thought you lost a $100 bill out of your wallet or your billfold, you might spend hours upon hours looking for this, checking all your pockets, looking through all your coats and then under the seats of your car. So you think about how that plays out. I think another great example is when you ground your kids from something, right? That is the loss aversion. You're taking something away from them for an hour or a day or a week. And so that is another example of this. But what really happens with the loss aversion is it really causes our thinking to tunnel vision on the upfront costs, those short run costs. Missing a rain, the fact that we use that phrase, we missed a rain, is really framing it in this cost standpoint. Oftentimes when we think about hiring outside services for our farm or for our business, we might lead with, oh, it costs X $100 to get my taxes filed, or this accountant is costing me this much money, the lawyer costs this much. We sort of lead with that information. The other thing about is common for most of us is going to the dentist. As soon as we think about going to the dentist, it's how much does it cost? Is it covered by insurance? And then, of course, that dreadful, what if they find something? It's pretty rare, at least for me, to go to the dentist and not come out with, an extra x-ray, or, we're watching this tooth, be careful with this tooth, to keep brushing this particular area. And so what are some strategies that can help us with this? first, we gotta be honest with ourselves and say, are we just trying to avoid bad news? Are we setting ourselves up for not wanting to have maybe a difficult conversation, or that we just are trying to short circuit something or delay something, putting that cost off for something down the road, which is problematic because it could compound, it could get worse. The second strategy here is to sometimes run the number, as Brent mentioned in that example. And as always, we'll share the slides afterwards so you can look at that. Anything over, $10 has a positive outcome for that bet. Expected value becomes positive. And so, like he said, we play riskier games with a lower outcome. And so you could think about how does that really play out? Run the numbers and really challenge yourself for that thinking. Another example, the third point, is probably the most powerful, is to reframe losses as wins. Or in some cases, you might want to flip that around and maybe think about the win is the loss instead of the win. You can flip that back and forth. Or it's also kind of like the idea of a pro-con list. Think about both sides of this. So if you missed a rain, I think missing a rain is a great example. If you get a rain, you'll be thinking about the next rain forecast by the next day. But if you miss a rain, you'll remember it for all week. But if you think about a missed rain versus a rain that you got, can you keep track of how much rainfall you've had throughout the summer? Is that a way to think about gains? Hiring outside servers, think about the hours of time that you could be managing your livestock, or you could be spending with your family instead of that service. Or lastly, you could think about going to the dentist as a way of avoiding really bad future outcomes, maybe a tooth loss or a really difficult procedure. So always be thinking about that as you reframing, as you think about that. The last example we want to share today is I want you to think a little bit about your crop budgets or your livestock budgets for 2023. I want you to start off by thinking about what's a corn price that you would use here for 2023. And when you write that down, then spend a few seconds thinking about what's a range of possible outcomes that might be possible. So maybe you start at $5.50 for corn, and then you think about an upper range and a lower range. And the reason why this is a powerful exercise is because there's a bias called the overconfidence bias. And in general, we are pretty optimistic or maybe confident whenever we make estimates. And in a lot of cases, the range of outcomes of reality is much wider than what most of us would anticipate. This is something that if you don't write it down or you don't think about it, it's easy to not capture. I think a really great example of this is maybe when your spouse or your friends or your kids ask you, when are you going to get done harvesting this field or planting this corn crop? It's really easy for us to say, well, my progress is this, and there's this many hours left, so I'll be done by 5:30. And the underlying assumption there is, well, if everything goes right, it'll be done at 5:30. But life has a way of, throwing wrenches in there. And those are the things that we overlook when we make those estimates. And so we always got to think about our estimates and how we can do a better job of creating some nuances around those. So some strategies, start with that point estimate that we said earlier, but then think of a likely range. That automatically sort of gets our brain to trick it a little bit, to start thinking about more than just sort of that knee-jerk reaction. I think another example is, do you think corn prices are going to go higher or lower? You can give yourself a response like that, instantaneously. But how can you challenge your brain or your thinking just a little bit to say, well, what's the probability of being 50 cents higher in a week from now? That's another example. Another thing to do is a strategy is to ask others about their range and why they think that. And finally, ask yourself, what are some scenarios that could go favorably or unfavorably for this projection that I'm making? And that could be another way of sort of getting out of that rut of just making that one estimate that is likely succumb to the bias of overconfidence. So to wrap this up, again, we just want to share 3 of these that are very common and persistent across lots of people, and want to challenge you to think about how maybe you fall into your own traps, but either these or others. So identify patterns of suboptimal decisions. Maybe there's a time of the year or a time of day, or there's a particular decision that you just fall into a trap for. So identifying it is a really important first step. I always remind my father and brother that, when they're busy combining wheat, planting double crop soybeans, haying for the cattle, is oftentimes when the market has a rally, and they're also concerned about getting the next rain. So that's a time that's results, it's oftentimes a suboptimal marketing decision. How can you plan ahead with some strategies? Again, reframe the situation, as we talked about, create some checklists or some scenarios to think ahead with, and finally, leverage your team, those family members in the operation or those you surround yourself with. First off, do you have an echo chamber? Are you going to only the people who you want to give you the feedback or the information you want to have? That's one issue. The second issue is, be diligent of asking for help, and people can bring fresh ideas to your thinking all the time.
Yeah, I think those are good. That's good advice. And I do that with David a lot because he provides a very different perspective than what I get around here. And I find that exceedingly useful. It's like with the overconfidence bias, my wife would not be surprised, but I suffer from that terribly. And I told David the other day that, I thought that the chances of collecting multiple peril crop insurance on irrigated corn where I live was basically 0% without a hailstorm or a major freak, wind event or something. But, this year is going to prove me wrong on that. And so, I just need to really work to overcome that overconfidence bias and realize that the range of possible outcomes is probably wider than I think.
So Brent, we're at the point where we're going to invite Jessica, our lender expert for the month, to join us. Really had a great time working with her, putting this episode together. Jessica, welcome. Thank you. The first question is to have you tell us a little about yourself. But the first thing to share is, what was your guess for what you would have accepted for that coin flip?
I was in the $20. So pretty much what the majority of the people on the call or on the webinar were. I agreed with them.
Great. So tell us a little more about yourself.
Sure. Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate you inviting me to be a part of this. I have been with Farm Credit Services of America for about 24 years, although all that time has been here in the Beatrice office in Beatrice, Nebraska. Throughout that time, I've worked both crop insurance and lending. I live about 15 miles northwest of town here, about 5 miles from where I grew up. I grew up on a farming operation. It was diversified. We had corn, soybeans, milo, wheat, cattle, and hogs. And so I spent my youth being active in 4-H and FFA, and then attended Southeast Community College in Beatrice, and then went on to attend the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. So.
Well, great. I want to kick this off by asking you to share a decision trap that you see a lot of producers, frequently falling into.
Yes. As I was listening to, your presentation, we see a lot of those things come in. One of the big ones, a couple of them, first of all, is at the end of the year where they're dealing with tax planning. And so we see a lot of that. We work with a lot of people throughout that time frame. And some of the things, that you can kind of use from your presentation to kind of offset that is first of all, planning ahead, completing a realistic cash flow, sitting down, figuring out, kind of anticipating what your income and expenses. And when I say, I mean realistic, don't try to be overly conservative or whatnot. So then you kind of have ahead of time what a potential tax issue could be. Revisit that 4 or 5 times throughout the year, keep it up to date. That can help you avoid, like you talked about, that level 1 and level 2 decision making. You don't want to that's a pretty big, tax planning is a big decision. You don't want to get into the last 2 weeks of the year and be scrambling and make some kind of messy, quick decisions that maybe aren't, they could be a little bit messy, maybe a little more costly because they're rushed, where, if you know some of that ahead of time, you might be able to work with your accountant ahead of time as you're making purchases throughout the year, do some different things that could help offset that. And this goes into some of the input decisions, marketing decisions. Those are all decision traps that people, you kind of get in a rut and you do the same thing over and over. And as things go up and down, you start getting nervous and maybe make some rush decisions again. But there again, that's where that projection and the cash flow can come into play. It's all about margin. And protecting your risk and just having a plan, taking your time, not making rush decisions for big things that are important. Getting the accountants involved earlier than just the last 2 weeks out of the year. If you're going to make a big land purchase, I've talked to someone here recently, and we see this all the time. They're going to be making improvements to a property, or they're making a land purchase that has a large depreciable asset on it. If you've got multiple entities, that's where you work with your accountant ahead of time to see, is there one avenue we can take to make this a better tax decision so we're not dealing with taxes down the road? And so we see those all the time. Yes.
That's really great, Jessica. I think a lot of times you think about this, got out off harvest, you get an estimate of what your tax bill might be. You have a few weeks left to make a decision. I know personally, I don't make good decisions in the time crunch. And so oftentimes that's a sort of a decision trap for me when I feel like I have the time pressure. And I guess my default is not to make any decision, but sometimes other people respond differently and I respond differently in different situations. So I appreciate you sharing that.
Mhm.
I want to talk a little bit about, these decision traps become more obvious or they become more paralyzing or more consequential when there's a lot of farm stress. There's a lot of financial stress in the farm. So when that stress hits a 10, what are some common themes that you've observed for folks who've been able to navigate that?
That's a great question because farming is a stressful, there's a lot of things that are out of your control and there can be high stress times. And then you add to it some sort of a shock or a tragedy, drought, hailstorm, death in the family member, anything like that, and it just could send the operation, in a tailspin. And so the biggest thing I would say, our advice is have a plan, not just a plan A, but have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, and make sure all the people that are part of the operation know what that is. This kind of goes back to that overconfidence bias that you guys were talking about, where, it's never happened to me, it won't ever happen. And so you kind of keep, plugging along as you always have. But the main thing that I would say, operations that have made it through some of those, they did have those plans in place. And when I say make a plan, really all you can do is focus on what you have control over. You don't have control over the weather, hail, prices, price changes. But the things you can control to offset that is your marketing, your risk management, crop insurance, hail insurance. All of those things help are part of a plan in place that can help offset those that could cause you so you're not in such a scramble. The other thing, if you've ever talked to a farm credit lender, you've probably heard the word strong working capital or good working capital. Good working capital can give you time to work through your plans, and good working capital gives you a cushion to fall back on when any kind of these shocks or changes or tragedies would come into or happen to your operation. The other one is if you have like a death or illness, different things, part of the plans that could be in place to offset that, or you have an estate plan, you've worked on a transition plan, you have life insurance, again, have adequate working capital so the operation can keep going. If you need to hire someone to come in and finish harvest or whatever you need to do, that right there, those are part of your plans. That if you don't have a plan, you don't know when any of these things could happen. They could happen at any time. I would make it a priority to get a plan and put a plan in place. And so that basically is the main suggestion we have for people, so you're not scrambling when something like that happens.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much for this. We're getting close to our 30-minute mark. I have one last question for you. If you could put a piece of advice on a billboard for thousands of producers to see here in July 2022, what would be that short message?
Be adaptable. That's the main thing. There's so many things coming at you. You can control, you can't control. It's just like when you're going, you're trying to get to a destination. You're trying to get your operation to be the most successful it can. And you have to, take a detour because of road construction. When you're mapping a route, you may have to reroute because something pops up. And so just be adaptable and be willing and able to do that.
Just a few questions. One is there a practical way to avoid bias in your thinking and kind of give us some practical advice? And I think when I hear that, I'm like, well, okay, what's a way to kind of relate this back? One of the things is to try and, when you're making a decision, try and make sure that, if you're making a decision under a lot of pressure or a lot of time stress or doing it very rapidly, that's a good time to kind of step back and not put it off. And I think it's hard because we're taught, I don't know about everybody else, maybe it's just me, but I think you're taught from the time you're young, make a decision and go with it. Just make a decision, do something, move forward, make a decision, make it work. Jack Welch, the former CEO General Electric, really rich, really famous, really smart guy, wrote his autobiography from the gut, make those gut decisions. And that's kind of that, rewarding that type 1 thinking. But sometimes that makes really bad decisions. And I think anytime you're under those conditions, you want to really put a flag up and say, do I need to contemplate a little bit more? Do I need to get some more advice? Am I falling for a narrative? And I think with marketing, that's so easy to do. You're going down the road, you're thinking, things aren't looking so good around here, and you hear on the radio there's gonna be a lot of heat and it's dry, and so you're like, well, prices are going up. Or the other way, prices are down today, and man, everything looks good, and I got to sell something. Well, that's probably not. It's probably best to avoid that and go back, do some calculations, take a look at things before you do it, because you might be succumbing to a whole bunch of these traps and decision-making traps.
But I think one kind of 30,000 foot idea here is we kind of have to admit to ourselves that we make bad decisions, and we have to be willing to admit that. And sometimes, we all know the person who spends a whole lot of time justifying why they weren't really wrong, right? They made that they did that level 1 decision. They fell into a trap, and then they spend all this time justifying why it was really the right outcome. And so I think you have to have a lot of humility and sort of curiosity and desire to invest in yourself and improve, and sort of, as Brent said, those red flags, look back, like, why did I make that decision? Like in hindsight, it wasn't the right decision. Was it because of time, or was it because of a narrative, or was it because of the person I was talking to who influenced me? And just kind of keep a list, maybe a journal, that would be ideal, but keep a mental list at a minimum of ways that you sort of fall into these traps from time to time.
When Daniel Kahneman was asked, what's the best way to make better decisions, what could you do? And he said, go easy, go to the local drugstore, buy a notebook, and anytime you make a big decision, write down what the decision is that you're facing, what the question is you're facing, what you're thinking about it, what you think the range of outcomes are, and what you decided. And the guy says, oh yeah, how does that work? He goes, well, no, I don't do that. I mean, are you kidding? Like, that's way too much work, right? And I think that's the reality, right? Like, it would be really helpful to do a decision journal. It's something you get a lot of value out of on the farm. I think it's one of the biggest things you can do to improve. Is it easy to implement? It requires a lot of discipline. And some of us, frankly, aren't that disciplined. I'm right there with it. I mean, my daughter, she could do it. She's very disciplined. Brent, less disciplined. And so it's harder for me to do it. But boy, I would get a lot of value out of it if we did it more regularly. When we were talking about this episode, one of the things we talked about was interest rates. And interest rates is a great example right now, because interest rates are changing rapidly. Okay. And so there's a lot of question. Well, now I need to do something about interest rates. But this is a good point to step back and evaluate the situation and whether you're succumbing to narratives and make a decision based on good information and sound for your business, and not a snap decision.
When it comes to interest rates, it's sort of, you can look at it as another risk management tool. When you pick a fixed interest rates, that's a way of mitigating, some increase in costs down the road. And, one of those the bias, and like you talked about, this all falls into that, is interest rates are going up. And so you panic and think you have to do something. Well, when you think about it, we are coming off of historically low, record-breaking interest rates. And so, it's natural that they're going to come back up. And so you think they're high now, but when you look back over the last 50 to 60 years, the long-term fixed interest rates are still very good compared to what they've been. And so the bottom line, when we have this question and we talk to people about this daily, is everyone's situation's different. What do you think is going to happen? What is your risk bearing ability? What's important to you? What do you want to protect against? And we can really put together custom rate packages, put some on short term, some on long term, and really do mixed, or maybe all on long term. However it is that we customize the interest rate and the package that we put together, the lending package for each individual person. And that's something we've been doing for the 24 years I've been here and before, not just now in a rising interest rate environment. It's something that you're just always thinking through every time you do that.
You brought up a lot of really good points. And the important thing is to get into your situation and get away from this idea of, oh, well, I'm going to predict the interest rates or whatever. What is the impact of rates going up or down, and try and evaluate that in your situation and ask yourself, well, do I want to take that risk or not? And I think that can be the most helpful. Usually we can get these decisions down to something that's pretty easy. Implementing it is the hard thing, because it might involve a change in a relationship or something like that makes it not necessarily fun to implement, but the decision is usually easy.
Like you said, sometimes when you put it down to numbers, you get so worried about, if you do this and you lock this in now, I'm going to be paying way more, interest or way less or whatever that is. But when you put it into dollars and cents and you calculate it back down to maybe per bushel or per head, and you're like, okay, well, there it goes back to that risk management. I am okay doing that. That's a minimal cost to my overall operation to offset one of those risks that I'm concerned about. And so those are the things I like what you said. And we do that a lot, where let's back it back down and put it into numbers.
That'll do it for another episode of Two Economists and a Lender. Thank you, Brent, David, Jessica, for leading the conversation today. And you in the audience, thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you online again next month.